The water wars within the Nile riparian states rages on.
Any threat to war or the use of military force is counterproductive.
Egypt warns Ethiopia against Nile dam construction.
Is Egypt going also to come to Kampala and say, don't construct a dam at Karuma?
Who has the veto powers over the Nile?
They're using the Nile within our country and taking a legitimate share of what should be Uganda's use of the Nile.
Where does this leave Uganda host to the now controversial Nile waters?
The Nile Basin question, if not well handled, can explode into a major conflict.
Join me, Daniel Arab Moy, in this edition of INfocus as we ask the bigger question. Can the Nile River states use the river without taking into consideration the interests of other river users? River Nile is historically known to be the longest river in the world. Its source starts right at this point in Uganda's eastern district of Jinja, crossing through the 11 riparian countries before pouring its waters into the Mediterranean Sea. Nile water experts seem to suggest that 30% of the waters that make up the Nile originates from this oozing point, while the 70% comes from the waters of the world's second largest freshwater lake, Victoria. The river starts its approximately 6,500-kilometer journey to the Mediterranean Sea here in Jinja, the district holding Uganda's Owen Falls Dam, which is the country's source of hydroelectricity, with Bujagali as the second and largest power dam. The Nile has remarkably contributed to the development and modernization of Uganda due to the fertility of its banks, which favors agricultural productivity. For many years, the waters of the river has been the source of life to reptiles, birds, humans, whose livelihood entirely depends on its existence in uninterrupted flow. Joseph Okiria is a fisherman living along the shores of River Nile, east of Uganda. The 30-year-old Ugandan fisherman depends on the Nile for his family's survival. The Nile waters has for years been the source of food for his family. He tells us the pride he has long developed for the Nile as he paddles the waters of the river in search of fish.
Tugamba naye tuyambe sajja azze tugoba tutandikira wakola ate wetukulira awo nekulidde awo nonya sente zange nensasula ennyumba nfune ekyakulya nsomesa abaana bange omo sente ezimu nga ntereka kuma abaana obulamu tuli wano.
For Okiria, fishing on the Nile as an economic activity has been a miracle, with the proceeds from fish sale educating his 8 children and sustaining the rest of the family members, including distant relatives. But when he heard the news concerning the controversies surrounding the usage of the resource that has for many years kept his family alive, his promising future seems to have all of a sudden torn apart.
Twenyimiriza amaka gange kuvuba nekira olusi bajja ati muve ku nyanja ate awo tufuna buzibu kati tuddewa yobole obuzibu otulaba buli mwe tetekanye kunoonya kisente wano wetunoonya sente osobola kola kibeeza makago kati awo botofunye eguni nga bakugobye nyanja awo tufuna bizibu.
Okiria is not alone. Thousands of other Ugandans who for years earned their living along the Nile one day woke up to an unexpected shock when the government of Uganda shut down the famous Bujagali Falls in favor of a new hydropower dam construction, which resulted into the disappearance of the rafting waters that once attracted thousands of tourists, earning residents millions in dollars. The needs of thousands of Ugandans whose survival depends on the waters of the Nile now seems to pose a challenge to the East African third largest economy in terms of making maximum use of the resources within its territory for our socio-economic development without necessarily compromising the legitimate right by our neighbors to the same shared resources.
The dynamics have changed. Even the British, who made us all sign that protocol, they no longer respect it. So the fact that Egypt does not want to admit that things have changed does not necessarily mean that we are not respecting their right.
Of specific interests and concerns, according to experts, is the consumptive use of the Nile waters for domestic, industrial, and irrigation. But Uganda also seems interested in regulating the river for optimal hydropower generation. And as a result, the East African country has been very keen on fostering close collaboration with the other 10 riparian countries in managing this shared resource. Most of Uganda's hydropower potential is concentrated along the White Nile, with an estimated potential of over 200 megawatts overall. But only 9% of Uganda's population is supplied with grid electricity. The 11 countries sharing the Nile waters are continuing to negotiate their way on how best they can share and protect the Nile River from changing climatic conditions and exploding regional population. But talks between the Nile water riparian countries have not been very successful, given the outburst by Egypt threatening military action against sovereign Ethiopia over the new Renaissance Dam construction along the Nile. Alemayehu Tegenu, the Ethiopian Minister for Water and Energy, says Ethiopia hired international experts to carry out a social and economic impact study on the water flow mode of the Nile, but Egypt rejected the results of the study, saying it was not sufficient.
No need of new study. It was carefully studied. The international panel of experts that we allowed to review the document has recommended to the studies, that is the social and economic impact and the water flow modeling. These two studies are very important for the Sudan and Egypt, but it doesn't stop the construction of the dam. We proposed to Egypt to study by hiring international consultants. Egypt refused to start with international consultants. Rather, it proposed to hire additional international panel of experts to put it on shelf and judge our construction.
Ahmed Abdel Aziz Mustafa, the ambassador of the Arab Republic of Egypt to Uganda, says the post-studies by Ethiopia were not enough and missing a lot of facts, fearing that such a project can endanger not only Egypt but Sudan's sources of water.
We also try to develop joint projects, because if that project, for example, if you are building a hydropower plant, like the one we have in Rusumo, you can see how many countries can benefit from it? And then you come together and put resources together and develop them for the interest of the other member states. So definitely there is always consultation if there is any major project that is being developed on the Nile Basin.
The sticking point dates back to the 1929 colonial Nile Water Agreement drawn by Britain. But the question remains, who owns the Nile waters?
It is just ridiculous that you have waters that flow through your land, fed on rain that rains in your land, and somebody else says you don't have a right to use these waters when it is there. Secondly, I think the Ethiopian case just tells you the arrogance of Egyptians. Yes, when the dam is built, it will have to fill. And filling the dam deprives the rest of the Nile, of water flow. Egypt would be sitting down with Ethiopia to say, how do we phase the filling of the dam in such a way that it doesn't undermine water flow to Egypt? It may take 1 or 2 years. Once it is full, it is the excess water which will drive the turbines and generate power. Of course, Ethiopia will do some irrigation with that lake, but still there will be excess water that will be going. And secondly, Egypt must be made to realize that the Nile was not created by God for Egypt.
Egypt has for many years claimed to have the 1929 agreement on her side, which granted her definitive powers of utilization of the Nile and the unquestionable authority to veto any development activities along the Nile. Sam Johnson Semaganda is a renowned foreign policy analyst and expert in international law, whose view seems to suggest the times have changed, and so does the development needs of countries sharing the Nile, but also acknowledges the rights of Egypt to protect the Nile.
The only way out of this mess is a dialogue, because there are facts on ground. First, you cannot stop the Nile from flowing from Uganda. You cannot stop these 11 countries from sharing the Nile. What are you left to do if you are Egypt and you're supposed to use the Nile? Because the fact of the matter is, Egypt survives on the Nile, but it cannot have all the bragging rights on the Nile. So the only way out of this mess, or if any controversy is going to come, the only way out of it is a peaceful, diplomatic, mature dialogue on the Nile. Unless nature saves us of one thing, it dries the Nile, which cannot happen.
Despite the fact that new agreements over the use of the Nile have been signed in the recent past by the riparian states, Egypt still holds an upper hand, controlling billions of cubic meters of the Nile waters every year. The consequences of these agreements, according to Semaganda, have severely harmed not only Ethiopia over the decades, but other riparian countries sharing the Nile. But as the water wars over the Nile rages on, scholars in Uganda fear that riparian states in the struggle to control the resource could potentially cause more harm economically, including the destruction of all the ecosystem that depend on it.
What would have been important is that Egypt should have followed up its reluctance to sign the new agreement that was made in 2010 and follow it up by recourse to the mechanisms in the international law organizations and institutions that would have made them seek justice.
Scholars in Uganda also argue that it's not right for any group or single state to take and use shared resources to its own advantage. But it also seems true that successive African governments under international law are bound to respect agreements entered into by the previous governments.
History backs Egypt. If you're going back to history, all the agreements were signed. All these, for example, the agreement that Uganda has with Egypt over the Nile, or the countries where, for example, Sudan, Uganda and Egypt and all the places where the Nile flows, these countries were not dragged into these negotiations. They were not dragged into these agreements. They were not blindfolded. They were looking. Signatures appended onto these documents. Now, Egypt has the authority, has the right to speak about issues that really affect it. And these issues have come a very long way in history, which we cannot just close our eyes not to see.
Uganda has hosted the controversial Nile waters seems to suggest that the 1929 British-Egypt-Nile agreement cannot be the basis for the usage of the Nile many years after the colonial governments have left East Africa.
The agreement signed in 1929 did not take into account the interest of what we call the Nile Basin territories. It did not take into account the interest of Uganda, the interest of Sudan, now South Sudan as well, and the interests of possibly fringe states like Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, which all touch on the Nile. The 1929 agreement should not be used as an agreement cast on stone. It should be used as an agreement which can be adjustable depending on the individual rights and interests of the member countries that share the Nile. Even when that agreement was signed, the member states now should actually try to see the individual interests of the countries through which the Nile flows, through which the Nile starts, so that all of them benefit, not that one country should benefit at the expense of the other.
According to Uganda, Cairo's recent outburst is unfortunate because there is need for other conventional methods if Egypt felt it was going to be aggrieved by the building of the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Many people in Uganda say it's not yet too late, that there can be a rethink by Egypt to move away from its privileged position over the Nile and look for a sustainable relationship in which it will be able to benefit and also give opportunity to the other members of the riparian system to also benefit from the Nile.
Uganda's position is that the Nile is there for all member states. They should all be given an opportunity to use it. And no threat, economic, military, or otherwise, will be used to derail member riparian states from marrying their need for development with the effective utilization of the Nile as a resource.
Uganda's biggest threat seems not the building of hydropower dams, but the continued underdevelopment of countries within the tropics.
The Nile Basin question, if not well handled, can explode into a major conflict. So I think all countries that share the Nile must come together to agree on a new agreement rather than falling back the 1929 agreement. Historically, that's wrong. If they had to control all countries connected to the Nile, that shows Egypt that to have peace with the Nile, you have to have an agreement with all those countries mentioned, which border or where the Nile touches.
The water sector is one of the priority sectors of Uganda's economy because it directly impacts on the quality of life of the people and overall productivity of the population, with hydropower being the major source of electrical power in this East African country. Our investigation took us deep into the far end of the source of the Nile in Uganda, revealing more restrictions on fishermen whose activities were curtailed by the Ugandan government because of the controversies surrounding the usage of the Nile waters. According to our findings, Egypt declined to sign the Uganda-Entebbe Accord agreement that was aimed at replacing the 1929 colonial-era law that gave most of the Nile waters to Egypt and Sudan, and Uganda, being a member of the riparian countries, not only wants to equitably use the waters of the Nile, but also respect the rights of Egypt, whose survival depends on the Nile.
We need a law that regulates our relations, and that's why it is very, very important that this cooperative framework agreement is ratified by the member states and we move. So Egypt has consistently said, well, they would not want to be party to this. But of course, the other countries are sovereign states. They cannot go by what another country wants. But we have left the door open.
The ratification by Ethiopia's parliament of what many considered a controversial treaty sparked off a seemingly cold war with Cairo, who say their right to equitably use the waters of the Nile has been altered by Ethiopia.
There is a consensus among the riparian countries that the Nile resource, the Nile water is a shared resource, and as such, it needs consultation. And this cooperation is built on the principles of equitable and reasonable utilization and not causing significant harm to any riparian country while a riparian country is making use of its equitable and reasonable kind of share.
The ratification, according to political analysts, trims the powers of Egypt, allowing other riparian states to benefit from the waters of the Nile equally, without necessarily having to worry about any external threats from other member states.
The Egyptians are not going to come here using the draconian law that they signed agreement before independence. No. They signed agreement with the British and with some governors. They didn't sign agreements with the new dispensation of the African leaders.
Uganda's strong resolve over the use of the Nile not only takes into context the regional politics, but the interests of other users of the resource, which includes fishermen and tourists who earns the country huge revenues. But the war drum continues to sound as Egypt, which relies on the Nile for power generation, irrigation, recreation, and even its national identity, say repeatedly that Ethiopia will not take a single drop of the country's share of the river.
We can sit down and do an objective study of what it means if Uganda expanded irrigation based on Nile waters. How much water will it draw it off from the flow of the Nile, and to what extent will it affect the Sudan and Egypt? Once we see those, then we realistically deal with those things in an objective manner, not from the perspective of saying we have the means, the military means, to address this problem. Because, yeah, Egypt has fought Israel, a very small country, but fighting Ethiopia, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and eventually Congo is not going to be easy. It's actually a nonsensical thing, because you will create a dangerous split in Africa between Arabs and the black Africans. And so that option is not tenable.
The meltdown in rhetoric from the true propagandists is feared could well be received in a war-weary region that is becoming edgy over the development spurt, with the growing specter of the regional riparian states becoming increasingly sucked into the conflict and forced to take sides. Although Uganda and Ethiopia are known as the main sources of the Nile, all the countries of the region serve as a part of a wider feeder network for Lake Victoria and the voice of Egypt, whose livelihood entirely depends on the Nile, cannot simply be ignored.